There's a rumour going around that the FIA might be open to a return to engines with 10 cylinders in the future. Now don't get too excited about that, because even if they do push these things through and they do come back, running on biofuels or something similar, we're not going to see them until the mid-2030s at the earliest. But it's something to get people excited, I suppose. Or it might be something that Mr. Suliem is saying just to get everybody to forget that they hate him, if only for, 15 minutes or so. But it is a huge U-turn, and romantics are expecting these engines back. But realists are wondering whether or not it's a good thing, because of how much money has been sunk into the hybrids. We've got to be bordering on over €1 billion for these things now, or something along those lines, but at the same time you're opening up to smaller cars and lighter cars. But this is the FIA. They'd make the cars smaller, but still have them be the aircraft carriers they are today in terms of their weight. And this wouldn't be the first time the FIA has done a U-turn on turbos. While turbos had been made mandatory for the 1986 season, they did allow some concessions for the 1987 season, introducing the Jim Clark and Colin Chapman trophies for the highest placed non-turbos in 1987, and that lasted for only one season. The smaller teams simply could not afford turbos, and Tyrrell was the only naturally aspirated team in 1984, but they got hold of some turbos for 1985. But as we saw through 1986, turbos had become so powerful there was a safety concern, so they were slowly reeled in over 87 and 88 before being banned entirely for 1989, and the naturally aspirated 3.5 litre era began. The Jim Clark Trophy was essentially having something that the smaller teams could play for. It was like their own little championship that divided F1 into two distinctive classes, turbo and non-turbo, or rich and poor, and the drivers were allocated points based off where they finished in class, much like in endurance racing, but would get overall points as well. So if you finished 10th overall, you'd get no points for the overall tally, but you might have finished 3rd in the Jim Clark Trophy, so you'd get 4 points. The only winner of this trophy was Dr. Jonathan Palmer, driving for Tyrrell. Only 8 drivers were eligible over 5 teams, with the other drivers being Philippe Streiff, Philippe Alliot, Ivan Capelli, Pascal Faber, Roberto Moreno, Yannick Dalmas and Nicola Larini. The asterisks on Dalmas's scorecard are very interesting and confusing in equal measure. The FIA decided for some unknown reason that Dalmas hadn't done enough race events to be classified as part of the Jim Clark Trophy. Yet Moreno and Larini, who did fewer races, were counted, with Moreno getting 4 points for his 3rd in class at Australia, whereas Dalmas was 4th, 3rd and 2nd in class. So why Dalmas is excluded and Bobby M isn't, and Larini for that matter, I've got no clue. It might be because Lola ran one car for the majority of the season and then ran a second car for only the last 3 races, while Moreno, who joined AGS for the final 2 rounds of the season, was joining a team that ran one single car for the whole year. But still, the FIA gonna FIA. And it was a Frenchman that suffered. Yeah, that French bias you hear so much about. Oh wait, it's not Prost. Moving on. The 3.5 litre era began and there was a record amount of sign-ups for the 1989 season. 39 drivers were attempting to qualify for every Grand Prix, and it would have been 40 entrants if First Racing had got their car onto the grid, but it didn't pass the crash tests. That car that First Racing would have run later became the Life car in 1990, which had a, interesting season. But in 1989, as in 1988, McLaren secured a drivers and constructors double. Alain Prost won his 3rd championship, and yes, I will acknowledge that it was in controversial circumstances, while McLaren took their 2nd constructors in as many years. They weren't as dominant as they'd been in 1988, with Williams, Ferrari and Benetton all taking race wins that year, so McLaren won 10 of the 16 races instead of 15, and had quite the fair share of retirements. But aside from Prost's results in Brazil and Canada, they were scoring points when they finished, so they still obliterated the rest of the field. At the time, Honda was providing McLaren with V10 power, and like the turbo had been in 1988, the V10 was the class of the field, thanks to the leadership of Osamu Goto at Honda. Steve Nichols, Neil Oatley and company took the best bits of the MP4-4 and morphed it into the MP4-5, but at the end of the 1989 season, Nichols left to go to Ferrari with Prost, but the plan was for Oatley and Nichols to take the 5 and make it into successive models. Now Oatley apparently has the wind tunnel model of the MP4-5 in his house. But the MP4-5 was still successful. Senna won 6 races to Prost's 4, and the 13 poles Senna took that year allowed him to take his tally of poles beyond Jim Clark, who held the record before him. But the season was largely remembered for the tensions between the 2 McLaren drivers and their very public rivalry that culminated in that crash at Suzuka. Although, that would not be the end of things, as we later found out. With Nichols joining Prost at Ferrari, there was going to be no successive McLaren for 1990, with McLaren instead taking the MP4-5 and rejigging some bits and pieces to create the MP4-5B. And this wasn't an uncommon practice in those days, especially if your car was very competitive to start with, or you were one of the back of the grid teams struggling to get by. It is, though, a non-existent art in 2025, as every nut, bolt and washer is brand new for each season, and the days of Ferrari turning up to the first 2 or 3 rounds with last year's car are long gone. Even Red Bull this year, who are looking to undo the botched upgrades of 2024, have got an all-new car. The MP4-5B had new front and rear wings, reprofiled rear bodywork, larger radiators and some engine tweaks done. While McLaren had enjoyed supremacy over Ferrari in 1989 as Ferrari's new sequential gearbox had issue after issue, 1990 was a closer affair. While the McLarens had the qualifying advantage, the Ferraris were quite good on the heavy fuel loads, and the McLarens' qualifying advantages were wiped out. Prost and Senna ran each other close, with that collision at Turn 1 at Suzuka settling the championship in Senna's favour. At the end of 1990, technical director Gordon Murray left the Formula 1 team to go to the road car division and start work on the McLaren F1 supercar. So the rest of the design team at McLaren took the MP4-5B and morphed it into a new car, the MP4-6. The MP4-6 of 1991 was an evolution of the MP4-5, which was the standard of the time and still the standard today. You have to be really looking to notice the differences between this year's McLaren and last year's, for instance. But by the time 1991 rolled round, any massive advantage that McLaren had in the 88, 89 and 90 seasons had largely evaporated, and McLaren had to dig deep to fight against Ferrari and Williams. Williams had 2 weapons that Honda and McLaren had to fight against. The first was the Renault V10 that had really come along in the last few months, and the Oxfordshire-based team had also hired some maths geek called Newey, who had managed to turn March, or Leighton House, into a semi-competitive outfit despite not having much money to work with. While Senna had been in a prime place to cruise to victories if his car held up, he'd now be looking over his shoulder at Mansell. Although Senna might have been smiling to himself, seeing Prost and Ferrari not being competitive that year. So Honda took the V10 and extracted every last bit of horsepower they could out of it then, right? Well, not exactly. They added 2 more cylinders for some reason. It seems baffling, I know. This was an era where you could pick between 8, 10 or 12 cylinder engines so long as they were a V or W configuration. Refueling wasn't going to happen until 1994, so there were 3 schools of thought. V8s are cheaper and more economical but are down on power. V12s are powerful but expensive, and they're also thirsty and reliability wasn't great. So V10s were offering a better all-round solution. But this convergence would not be seen properly until the FIA ordered the engines to be shrunk for 1995. With the 3.5 litre formula, 8s was still an option if you had an aerodynamically sound car to use them with. Benetton, for instance. Now, I said that this car was going to be an evolution of the MP4-5B, but it wasn't quite that simple. Neil Oatley and Matt Jeffries assumed this would be the case, but then they saw that they were dealing with 12 cylinders and not 10, so a lot of their ideas were thrown out of the window, or they had to hastily adapt those ideas. They had to change the weight distribution, put a bigger fuel tank in, make the chassis longer to get it all to fit properly, and they were worried that the wheelbase would get too long. Not as long as the wheelbases are now, but for the time, it would have been long. And they had to stick even bigger radiators on to get it all to work. I've placed the 5B and 6 on your screen with the 5B on the left, 6 on the right, so you can see what changes were made. If those changes have been picked up, these models are usually just for illustration purposes only, but I hope that they give you some sort of indication. And links to the cars, as always, will be in the description, so if you want to, you can drive them in Assetto Corsa later on if you wish. Although, if the cars are anything like they used to be, you'll probably end up going through Copse Corner flat out at 190, which... well, just no. But I'm not the only person confused by all this, because Senna was as well. He quite liked the Honda V10, and he was wondering why they added 2 extra cylinders and messed up the weight distribution, messed up the power delivery, messed up the torque delivery, messed up, well, basically everything, because it was going to make it heavier and make it handle like a canal boat. When he originally tested the car, he found that it understeered like a dog. So, what's the actual point? Because Honda wasn't running this thing at full power either. Yeah, Honda wasn't running the car at full tilt. They were going for reliability more than anything else, so that then refers you back to the previous question. V10s have been proven to be more reliable, so why not keep that instead? The power to weight would have been better with a V10, the nimbleness would have been better with a V10, the turning would have been better with a V10, the weight distribution would be better with a V10. Everything is better with a V10, which sounds like something that an F1 channel that functions solely on memes would have put on a t-shirt. Or a hat. Senna sat there thinking, well, I've got an engine that's not even running at full power. What is the point in me even turning up for work? I might as well just take the old car out and we might as well just run that. Although the design team did make some subtle changes to the aero and did some other bits and pieces, but that wasn't making Senna or Gerhard feel any better. But, while still having concerns about the car, Senna ended up winning the opening 4 races. The Williams had something that was going to go in McLaren's favour, and that was horrendous gearbox issues. Williams, like Ferrari, had transitioned over to the flappy paddle sequential, and like Ferrari, because it was their first attempt at utilising this new technology, it was a bit fragile. While McLaren had that cushion to Williams after the first 4 races, they were still looking over their shoulders. When, not if, Williams got those issues ironed out, McLaren was done. And because Senna was, well, Ayrton Senna, he had a win at any cost mentality. So he would end up driving the car in such a way that was incredibly risky. And I'm not talking about a here's another driver's safety type of risky, because Matt Jeffries told Motorsport magazine that Senna had the mentality of the race is at the beginning, so I'll drive harder then, build a gap and fuel save after that. Senna would end up using more fuel than he should have done at the start of the Grand Prix, and would have the pit wall screaming at him to back off. And this worked at races where fuel saving is easy because he could, well, just back off and save the fuel. But at Silverstone and Hockenheim, he actually ran out of fuel in those 2 races. There was some conflict on the design team as well. Henri Durand had come over from Ferrari and was working on the car, and he basically claimed that he'd done the car and fixed it and they should just keep running the same car for the rest of the season. But the rest of the team was saying, no, we need to find like 2/10 every single race to try and stay ahead of Williams. And at the Hungarian Grand Prix, McLaren brought a lighter chassis which helped things to, get back on track. But the season wasn't without its scares. Senna had run out of fuel at Silverstone and Hockenheim, and his electrics had failed at Montreal. At the same time, Honda had managed to unlock some performance from the engine. In the same Motorsport magazine article that the fuel story comes from, Jeffries explained that the whole season was difficult from a design perspective because his phone would be ringing constantly with Senna banging on about what needed to be done about the car. Honda would then turn up and say, hey, we found another 10 horsepower, and Senna would demand to see the dyno charts, not taking the new engine unless it was going to have the power required and be reliable. The thing was, the design philosophy of cars had now changed, and while McLaren had enjoyed the advantage with the MP4 4, 5 and 5B, by the time the 6 came into service, the other teams had started to catch up with their own designs. Think Audi in the World Rally Championship once everybody else adopted 4-wheel drive, or Lotus when everybody else adopted wings or got their hands on a DFV. The car was a bit too conservative compared to what Ferrari and Williams had got, and with Williams now using a sequential gearbox and utilising more advanced aerodynamics, such as slimmer cockpits and other stuff, they'd closed the gap. McLaren still had an H pattern in the car, and as such needed a wider cockpit, but they did add a longer nose to improve the aero for the Japanese Grand Prix. And then you've got the famous shot of Mansell and Senna that year, side by side at Barcelona with the sparks flying off, and you can see how Newey and Head had designed their car versus Jeffries and Oatley. The side pods on the Williams were lower, the cockpit was narrower, the radiators were smaller, the car was lighter, and I think the suspension on the Williams was different too. McLaren had gone pushrod suspension while Williams was on pull, or something, I don't know how the suspensions work. And actually, saying that, frick is something I need to cover one day. What I'm saying is, overall, the Williams was a much, much slimmer package compared to the bulky McLaren. And after the Canadian Grand Prix, Senna's fears were realised because Williams and Mansell mounted one hell of a comeback. Mansell was second in Mexico and then won at Manicourt, Silverstone and Hockenheim. He might have also had a win at Canada, but he celebrated too early and lost hydraulics, handing the win to Piquet. Senna, meanwhile, finished 4th because of the running out of fuel thing at Silverstone, was 7th in Germany for the same reason, and then finished behind Mansell at Mexico and at Manicourt. After the Monaco Grand Prix, Senna's lead in the championship was 29 points ahead of Prost and a whopping 34 ahead of Mansell. After Hockenheim, that lead had shrunk to just 8 points. Senna had 51, Mansell 43, Patrese 28, Prost 21 and Berger 19. So the championship this year was probably going to be a lot harder than 89 and 90 ever were. Senna then won in Hungary and Belgium to stretch the lead back out, gaining 14 points on Mansell in the process, because Mansell was second in Hungary and then retired at Spa. Mansell got 4 points back at Monza where he won with Senna coming second, but was then disqualified from the Portuguese Grand Prix. This being after a wheel was improperly fitted to Mansell's car at a pit stop and they fitted the new wheel outside of the pit box, which was illegal. The disqualification had Senna 24 points ahead, meaning that he had over a 2-race win cushion with 3 races left. After the Spanish Grand Prix, the gap had come down to 16 points as Mansell won with Senna coming 5th after an uncharacteristic spin when it started raining. For the 5th year in a row, the title would be decided at Suzuka. Mansell had to win to keep the title alive, and if Senna won, that was it. He was champion, as there would be 1 race left and too many points to overhaul. Mansell spun off at turn 1 on lap 10, and Senna came second behind Gerhard Berger, although Senna had allowed Gerhard through to take the victory as a thank you for his hard work, and it was the last time that Senna, Prost, Piquet and Mansell were all on the grid as one big group. Prost was dismissed from Ferrari after this race, and Piquet retired at the end of the year. So when Prost came back in 1993, there was no more Nelson. Senna took his 3rd and final championship with that 2nd place at Suzuka. It was probably his most hard-fought championship win, and most articles I've read for this video say that it was his best. In 1988, he was winning races from the front row. In 1989, he only had to beat Prost again, although their rivalry had escalated by this point, and in 1990, he fired Prost off the road, which got a lot of people thinking he knew he couldn't win clean, so he deliberately took him out. And this has been something that's been talked about over the last 35 years. And it will be 35 years since that 1990 Japanese Grand Prix, won't it? Wow, I am now old. But in 1991, he saw off pressure from Mansell and Williams, with McLaren managing to keep an increasingly uncompetitive car in front. So it proved that Senna, when he had to dig deep over a season, could come out on top. And the engine only blew up 3 times over the course of that season, all 3 of those engine failures affecting Gerhard Berger, which is a pretty good strike rate for a V12. But it still doesn't really answer the question of why V12. Surely sticking with the V10 would have been a much more viable option, and yeah, I do agree with you on that. Like mentioned, this was the days of experimenting, and we were 3 years into the new engine cycle. Ford stuck to V8s because that's what they were making pre-turbo. Renault had no experience of non-turbos in Formula 1, so they went with the middle ground of the V10, and they just ended up being very good at it. Judd used V8s because they were a company that rebuilt and prepped DFVs, so it made sense to them. But then you've got Subaru, who tried to revive a flat 12 and it went badly. Lambo and Chrysler tried V12s to no avail. Life had the W12 in 1990, which went badly, and Ferrari used V12s because, well, that's what Ferrari does. Supposedly, when they brought in the new rules for 1989, it was going to be only V8s, 3.5 litre V8s that is. But Ferrari apparently went, let us use V12s or we'll quit for IndyCar. But I don't know how true that story is. Maybe that's one for the future, if I can find the info. I wish I could spin you some insane story like Honda knew how badly Senna wanted to beat Prost, so they gave Senna a V12 so that he could rub Prost's nose in it once, Honda and Senna beat Ferrari and Prost. Or it was something like Honda just wanted to measure its knob against Ferrari by saying it doesn't matter if we've got 10 cylinders, 12 cylinders, a heavy engine, a light engine, a powerful engine, a not powerful engine, we will beat you. But the more I read, the more it turns into the very, very, very boring, well, Honda just wanted more power. I read that V12s were apparently the preferred engine choice of Soichiro Honda, and it was all done simply as a tribute. But Honda-san died in the August of 1991, so I doubt that's true. But what is true is that V12s with their smaller cylinders are good for producing power at high revs per minute, while V8s are good for producing the power a bit lower down. Honda wanted more power and they got it, but it wasn't without its drawbacks. As such, it's the only V12 engine to win the championship. And I know what you're going to start typing down in the comments. You forgot Niki Lauda. But the thing is, Niki had a flat 12. It's not the first time somebody with 12 cylinders has won the championship, but it was certainly the last time that somebody did, and the only time that somebody won with those 12 cylinders in a V formation. As the years went on, and with refueling around the corner, there was no need for a 12-cylinder engine anymore, and with the engine displacement shrunk for 1995, the writing really was on the wall for V12 engines. Even Ferrari got rid of them, and they've not been back since. It was also the last time that somebody won a world championship with an H-pattern shifter. From this point on, full auto or flappy paddles. So it was an end of an era all round. So then, a look at the McLaren MP4 6, the only V12 powered car to win the championship. If this has been a look through the motorsport history books that has got you thinking and also explained some bits and pieces, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And if you want to see more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks, as always, go out to the mad lads over at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and I've added some new names to the list because this is the first video of the month. And if you want to join that list, there's a link to Patreon in the description, as well as links to Discord, socials, and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup or get me a sausage roll, and there's memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.